maybe you can
Sure.
tell us about like how when trauma happens to somebody, how like it happens in the brain, because I know you were talking about like fight and flight and
Yep.
all this stuff. So maybe give us a little idea into how that happens.
Like you can have people who've had no childhood trauma, no issues, or seemingly no issues, I should say. And then, like when I'm dealing with people with PTSD, as cops, for example, they've been perfectly well functioning, no issues, no massive things of note. And then one event can happen and can change how they're feeling, how they're thinking, and what they're focusing on is probably the key. When it comes to childhood trauma, it's a little bit different because they haven't fully developed yet. They're young children and they're having things, maybe bad things happening to them, and some of it they just can't understand. So there's a couple of different, I guess, pathways to the trauma. And if I kind of bundle them all together and say, okay, regardless of what trauma you've had or that kind of stuff, it becomes a pattern of the way you think, kind of where people get stuck. So if let's just use it as an example that I'm in a bad way right now. I've had things happen, whether it's long-term things or whether it's a one-off. Essentially what's happened is I've got a memory of some event or events, and it affects me in a certain way. What happens is when we think about that memory again, our neurons wire and fire together. And every time we think about the same thing, so if we replay the same event or events in our heads, we kind of, our neurons will fire, and then by me going over the same ground over and over, effectively it creates a bit of a pattern in my brain and almost a shortcut. Our brains are designed to do that. When we learn something new, like driving, for example, it's a bit of a mind ache because you've got to think about lots of things. But then as we get better at it and do it much more often, our neurons have wired and fired and becomes kind of habitual and just kind of easy. You don't even think about going on long drives when you're as old as I am and driven as long as I have. Whereas it's no different with the way we form these habits. And look, most habits are actually good for us. Like I say, we want to be cognitive misers. We don't want to use a lot of energy all the time. So once we learn that skill, it just becomes easy. Unfortunately, that can also work against us. So in a PTSD scenario, if someone's rethinking that same event, what it does do is, so if we think about the amygdala, right, it's the small part of our brain that's linked to our fight or flight, which you talk about, and it's our emotion center. So if there's anything highly emotional, the amygdala is highly involved in it. And there's nothing wrong with that. Our emotions are there to help us, give us kind of, it's basically saying to us, hey, take note, something's happening here. And so that's what it's designed for. Unfortunately, the way our brains work is we can go over and over and over and then create that pattern. And so being stuck in an emotion can be a problem because you're focusing just on where the amygdala driven stuff is. When I run my programs and try to change this stuff, I'm trying to get people to switch over from where they're focusing. And we've talked about, what you focus on is what you get more of. So if I'm focusing on that whole experience, which either makes me sad or angry or whatever that emotion is, again, amygdala driven emotion, I call it red brain. So what I'm trying to do is switch it over to where I'm actually using my prefrontal cortex, which is the big part of the brain. I'm actually using, I guess, biology to change my gears around a bit. So someone who's in amygdala-driven thoughts, if you like, a focus, like when you go into a fight or flight scenario, blood goes from your brain into your muscles, getting you ready for fight or flight. So if I'm constantly doing that pattern in my head, I'm doing that to myself in a way because it's a memory now. It's not the event happening in real time. So what I'm trying to do from a biological sense, I'm trying to change those things around. So if I am working with somebody, I say, look, I need you to do some analysis work. So I get you to do a thoughts diary. The reason I'm doing that is about making you think with the blue part of the brain and pumping blood back up there because you're doing analysis work. That part of the brain is involved in analysis work, whereas the amygdala is not. So little things that can change that focus to be using that part of the brain and not the amygdala is a really important thing that you're trying to do. And there's many ways to do that and change that focus. Some people can just do it naturally, but using as a counselor, you want them to be doing things that interrupt that wiring and firing. So what was wiring and firing over here in red brain, just by making you go, think about your thoughts and just write one line down, means that whole cascade of the neurons wiring and firing is actually loosened a bit. So you might go down that path, you don't go all the way, and now you're making an interruption and you're using another part of the brain. So you're slowly trying to do that, and over time you will add things to their activities to get them to break the cycle. And so you can effectively replace that habit of red brain with a slightly different habit. And over time, you can kind of move your way away from that, if that makes sense.